This podcast contains adult themes, descriptions of violence, and explicit content. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Dark Night Mysteries, where we explore lesser-known true crime stories that don't often get the attention that they deserve. While many of you are probably familiar with more notorious names like Dahmer, Bundy, Gacy, or BTK, we're mostly going to be focusing on lesser-known cases, though we may occasionally explore the infamous ones too, especially if there's lesser-told angles worth investigating. Now, before I jump in, I do want to take a moment to note that some of the content that we discuss can be pretty dark and disturbing. If you are not feeling mentally prepared for that right now, please take a moment to take care of yourself. You can always come back to this episode when you're ready. Your well-being is our top priority. Also, I want to give a quick heads up about today's case. There's going to be a lot of discussion surrounding Satanism, pedophilia. It's important to note that anything mentioned here is specific to Ramirez's beliefs and does not represent Satanism or any of its subsects. We are not making any statements about the religion itself or our personal beliefs. This is simply a reflection of what Ramirez himself believed and expressed. Some of Richard's victims were as young as 6, and the details about these attacks are primarily sourced from the victims themselves or the detectives that were involved in the investigation. We do advise caution when listening to these parts of the episode, especially if you find discussions of young victims difficult to process right now. And as always, if I missed something or if you feel like there's more to add to today's case, please feel free to leave a comment or let us know. We're here to learn and reflect together. Now, grab a cup of coffee or whatever makes you happy, like maybe a snack, and I'm going to pour myself some coffee and let's get into today's episode, The Birth of the Night Stalker. You're listening to Dark Night Mysteries, where we shine a light into the darkest corners of human nature. This is episode 1, Making of a Killer, Birth of the Night Stalker. Before he became the Night Stalker, before the terror, the headlines, the trials, he was just Richard, a little boy born into chaos. A boy shaped by war, by family secrets, by violence, and by demons, both real and imagined. This episode explores the making of a killer, not through excuses, but through understanding.
I believe in the evil in human nature. This is a wicked world, and in a wicked world, wicked people are born. I'm not going to blame society, my race, or people, or anything. It is up to the individual like myself to keep on knocking on whatever door they want to get into.
In the early 1980s, Southern California was struck by a wave of fear. It wasn't just the hot summer nights or the bustling streets. It was the chilling sense that something or someone was lurking in the shadows. A predator. A man who struck under the cover of darkness, leaving only death and dread in his wake. This was the beginning of reign of terror that would span 14 months. And the man behind it, Richard Ramirez, the one that the world would know as the Night Stalker. But killers aren't born overnight. So how did a man go from being a troubled child to one of the most infamous serial killers in American history? To understand the horror that Ramirez unleashed, we have to start at the beginning. His childhood, his influences, and the twisted path that led to bloodshed. This is how the Night Stalker was born. Richard Ramirez was born February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, to a family that would prove to be just as dysfunctional and violent as the world that he would later enter. He was the youngest of 5 children born to the Mexican immigrants. Robert, Rosa, Joseph, and Reuben were his older siblings, and they were all born with birth defects because their mother had worked at a boot factory where she was exposed to chemical fumes while pregnant. Now, some sources do say that only Richard was born with a birth defect from her working at the boot factory. Other reports say that all 5 of them had birth defects. His father, Julian Ramirez, was a hard man, strict, abusive, and quick to anger. His mother, Mercedes, was very deeply religious and often overbearing, but emotionally distant. But it wasn't just the household violence that had shaped young Richard. There were other forces, darker ones, that played a role in shaping the man that he would soon become.
I don't give a shit. Now what? No, I want you to go sit down. Lay down like you're doing all day. Just stay there.
From a young age, Richard's life was shaped by turmoil. His father had regularly punished him and his siblings to the point where Richard had felt safer sleeping in a cemetery than he did in his own home, because the dead were very predictable. Dead couldn't hurt you if you upset them. Richard's early life was riddled with trauma. Long before the violence that he would one day unleash upon others, it had found him. From as early as age 2, Richard had suffered a series of head injuries. He fell from a dresser when he was trying to reach a radio. There was a playground swing that struck him in the head, a football to the head, a car crash, falling or perhaps jumping out of a moving train, even being thrown from a horse. All of these incidents had led to lasting neurological issues, including seizures, impulse control problems, and violent tendencies. For someone like Ramirez, these traumas may have been the first dominoes in a much darker chain reaction. However, the trauma that was inflicted by his older cousin Mike, that one would leave an enduring mark on Richard's soul. Mike, a former soldier who had served in the Vietnam War, had become a sort of mentor to Richard. But rather than offering the comfort and the security that he sought, Mike had subjected him to a life of violence and fear that would haunt him forever. When Richard was just 12, the two of them bonded over marijuana joints and gory stories. And according to Philip Carlo's The Night Stalker, Life and Crimes of Richard Ramirez, Mike had actually taught his younger cousin some of the military tactics that he had learned during his time in Vietnam, such as killing with stealth. Mike showed him disturbing pictures of Vietnamese women that he claimed to have raped, tortured, and killed. This, quote, likely fused in the prepubescent child's mind sex with violence, according to Dr. Scott Bond, a criminologist. In the next year, Richard Ramirez had witnessed that same cousin shoot and kill his wife after a domestic dispute. Mike went to prison for his crime. Even though he was found not guilty of the murder by reason of insanity, He was released 4 years after incarceration at the Texas State Mental Hospital, after which point he and Ramirez had resumed their close relationship. Though Richard saw this as a rite of passage, and in his young mind, it only emboldened him to follow in his cousin's footsteps. Richard's first known run-in with the law came in 1974 at just 14 years old. He was caught attempting to steal something. Then, in May of 1976, he was charged with theft that was listed as, quote, over $20, but less than $200. No further details were given for either of these crimes. The next month, Richard was caught burglarizing a residence. In July, he had received a warning for disorderly conduct. In September, he was again accused of burglary, but that case was dropped due to a lack of a statement from the accuser. In October, Richard was warned by the El Paso police for vandalizing U.S. postal property. Then, on December 16th, he was once again accused of breaking into a home. This time, the person who had pressed charges waited nearly 2 weeks to do so, and no details were ever provided about what, if anything, had been taken. This final incident was the only one that had led to a court appearance, which took place in March of 1977. Still, Richard was never placed on probation. He was never arrested, and he was never formally punished for any of these crimes. It wasn't long after that he started living with his sister Rosa and her husband, who, unbeknownst to Rosa, was secretly a voyeur, often dragging Richard along with his nighttime prowls. Her husband had begun taking Richard late at night to go look into the windows of women who were undressing. This is actually when he began breaking into homes. According to El Paso Times archives, Richard Ramirez had also taken part in occult rituals in the desert with other kids in his age group. That did include drinking the blood of animals. In 9th grade, he had dropped out of high school and moved to Los Angeles, where his criminal activities had only escalated. He was using LSD, he was stealing cars, and he was spiraling deeper into addiction and delusion. He was even briefly locked up for stealing and had been arrested 3 times for marijuana possession. His first arrest for drugs was when he was 17 years old. He was arrested again 2 years later in 1979 and then again in 1982. All 3 arrests were for less than 2 ounces of marijuana.
This is the police department. Put your hands up. I want to see your hands to the sky.
Not long after dropping out of school in the early 1980s, he had moved to California. He had developed a cocaine and heroin addiction, and then returned to burglary. He had also started becoming interested in Satanism after he met a man who introduced him to it. Over the next few years, he was arrested twice in Los Angeles for auto theft, first in 1981 and then again in 1984. At the same time, he had begun to neglect his personal hygiene, a sign of the deeper struggles that he was facing. The acid, Eddie Millam, an old childhood friend, claimed, quote, messed with his head. But Millam was just one of many who had believed that drugs only played a role in his psychological decline, although they couldn't fully explain what was brewing beneath the surface. However, the drugs alone were not able to explain the darkness taking root. His descent into a world ruled by ritual, sadism, and obsession had begun. As a child, Richard looked up to both Mike and Rosa's husband, but instead of guidance, they exposed him to darkness, violence, voyeurism, and crimes. Richard was never really the same. A childhood friend and a classmate, Ray Garcia, had recalled that Ramirez had seemed to lack even the most basic self-discipline. Quote, all he would ever eat were chocolates and Pepsi. He would never brush his teeth. I used to tell him to close his mouth or to brush his teeth. End quote. His teeth would actually play a huge role in his arrest, his trial, and his conviction. But that's another story for a whole nother day. When Richard was a teenager, he had become a completely different person. He was known for his strange, erratic behavior, sometimes calm and almost withdrawn. Other times, he was wild-eyed and menacing. But it was clear that the drugs and the other mental health issues that he was currently facing were changing something inside him. And the world around him wasn't really helping. With a few friends and a broken home life, Richard had begun to feel like an outcast. He felt rejected and isolated from society. But it was the growing obsession with violence, death, and Satanism that would eventually push him over the edge. While he was still in high school, Richard had actually begun working at a hotel where he would use his master key to break into guest rooms. In one break-in, Richard had actually tried to rape a woman while her husband was out. In another, he had reportedly molested 2 young children in an elevator. In every break-in case, though, Richard had begun stealing from guests. He was quickly fired from that job. But his darkest act during this period wouldn't be discovered until years later, when his DNA had been linked to the 1984 rape and murder of a 9-year-old Mei Luang in San Francisco basement. Richard was working and living at the hotel for a period before her body had been found stripped naked and hanged from a pipe. Although Ramirez's DNA was linked to the crime years later, another suspect's DNA was also found at the scene. However, due to the sample's incompleteness, the match was ruled unreliable by San Francisco's crime lab. Quote, the case is classified as open still due to the second suspect issue. Semen found in a handkerchief near the victim's body was traced to a convicted felon, but the man was a juvenile at the time of the crime and his name was not released. Detective John Miller. Richard's obsession with Satanism and dark forces became more pronounced. He had adopted a new identity, a persona that had glorified evil, worshipped chaos, and gave him a sense of power and control. He became fixated on the idea of committing violent acts, fueled by his distorted sense of revenge against the world that had wronged him. And so, by the time that he had reached his late teens, Richard Ramirez was no longer just a lost soul. He was a predator, one who was ready to The quiet streets and sprawling neighborhoods would soon be drenched in fear, as one by one, Richard began his terrifying crime spree. He stalked his victims under the cover of night. He did not care about race, age, or gender. He was indiscriminate and sadistic in his violence. He ruthlessly abducted and abused children, but would also sexually assault the elderly women that he had found sleeping in their homes, with equal vicious enthusiasm. The press would later call him the Night Stalker, which was a fitting name for a man who stalked his victims under the cover of darkness, leaving only a trail of death and destruction. wherever he went. The attacks were brutal. The motives were unclear. Richard would break into homes, attack couples, mutilate victims, and leave behind satanic symbols at some scenes, or he would scrawl message at others. Sometimes he would kill both victims. Other times he'd let one live to tell the tale. He would abduct a 6-year-old girl from her home while she slept, threaten her with a gun, molest her, and then abandon her after he was done. Detective Sarlano said, quote, "At the time, there was a series of child abductions, or attempted abductions of children, in which every single one of those children was sexually assaulted. These included another 6-year-old girl from Montebello, who was taken from a schoolyard, molested, and abandoned. A 9-year-old boy from Monterey Park was snatched from his home while he slept. He was molested and then abandoned. An 8-year-old girl from Glassell Park was abducted from her bed, assaulted in a car, and then abandoned. None of these cases were ever officially confirmed to be the work of Ramirez. However, all the children that had described the person that took them had said he was, quote, tall, thin, light-skinned Hispanic or Caucasian, messy hair, brown stain-capped teeth, all black clothing, a members-only type jacket, and he was very smelly. Detective Gil Correa, co-lead investigator on the Night Stalker case, has been on record several times saying that he thinks those child abductions were related to the Night Stalker crimes. No one else in the unit at the time believed they could have been the same person, and in fact, they had laughed Gil out of the room for even suggesting it. Gil did say in the Netflix documentary The Night Stalker, The Hunt for a Serial Killer, that what Ramirez wanted, foremost, was to see the distress in the victim's eyes. Detective Frank Salerno stated that in that same documentary, the interesting thing is how comfortable he got after killing somebody. He would take the time to have a snack. That's a pretty sick individual.
Woman in her 60s and stomped her to death with his foot, leaving an imprint of a shoe on the side of her face. From that to just executing somebody upon walking into a room after he entered a house. He strangled, he used a ligature, he used a tire iron on a young girl, beat her, left her for dead.
Richard's reign of terror would stretch from June of 1984 to August of 1985, during which he would terrorize the people of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and all surrounding areas, often committing multiple murders in a single night. The whole state was on edge. People had began locking their doors, peeking through windows, and sleeping with lights on, which was really uncommon during this time. But these burning questions remained. Who was the Night Stalker? What drove him to such depths of evil? For over a year, police had struggled to catch him. They were unable to find leads while Richard had continued his killing spree. Detectives would later discover that law enforcement had actually come dangerously close to apprehending Richard Ramirez before his killing spree had ever fully began. While reviewing an older abduction report, one case in particular had stood out. A woman had managed to fight off an attacker who had fled the scene in a yellow Toyota. Not long after that, the same vehicle was pulled over by a motorcycle officer for a routine traffic violation. The man behind the wheel had no identification and was ordered out of the car. The officer had him put his hands on the hood of the car and returned to his motorcycle to retrieve the citation book when a radio call came through, an APB describing an attempted abduction matching the yellow Toyota. Right then, the suspect, quote, defiantly drew a pentagram on the hood of the vehicle and made a run for it. That was according to Detective Gil Carrillo. The car was then taken into custody for evidence processing. But in a baffling misstep, the LAPD had left it sitting, forgotten, in the hot sun for weeks. Now, during this time, they were in the middle of a heat wave. East Los Angeles was on its consecutive days of 100+ weather. So by the time that investigators had returned to process it, any fingerprint evidence had, quote, been burned away by the heat. The pentagram wasn't just a symbol, though. It was a link, and it connected this close call incident to several of Richard Ramirez's crime scenes. At the very first murder scene, investigators had recovered a piece of potential evidence, a black baseball cap with the ACDC logo printed across the front. Later, a former classmate had told the New York Times that Ramirez had been obsessed with the band's song, Highway to Hell. In the Night Stalker documentary on Netflix, The Hunt for a Serial Killer, Esther Pechard had recalled a moment that still haunted her. She had actually seen Richard pick up that exact hat at the Salvation Army thrift store during her lunch break from work. Here are her words describing what she remembers.
And I picked it up because the letters on it said ACDC. And I didn't know what that was, and I thought it was kind of weird. And so I threw it back down. And then on my right, here comes this man, and he stood right there and picked up the hat, looked at it, turned around and looked at me, and kind of smiled a little bit. And he had the devil on his hand. It was a picture, it was a round circle with the face of the devil, you know, with the horns. And he got the hat, walked away. When I went home from work, I was on the freeway with my little car, and here comes somebody speeding way behind me. And then all of a sudden he just swerves around my car. It's like he's right there, like a moment stop. And he turns and he's looking at me. I remembered, you know, that was the same guy I saw at the thrift store. And he has this horrible big grin, and he's missing all these teeth. He just stared at me like a weird smile. It was like a killer clown.
The pentagram would continue to appear throughout the case. During a preliminary hearing following his arrest, Ramirez had famously raised a hand with a pentagram drawn on it and shouted, "Hail Satan!" At trial, one victim testified that he had forced her to swear upon Satan, and another victim had said that he had forced her to tell her love for Satan. In a later interview, Ramirez had offered a chilling insight to his beliefs. He had described Satanism as a, quote, undefiled wisdom instead of hypocritical self-deceit, and added, it is power without clarity. Satan admits to being evil, and we are all evil in some form or another.
As far as Satan is concerned, I believe in a malevolent being. His description eludes me, but I have felt powers that are evil.
His tall, slender frame, sharply cut jawline, impossibly high cheekbones, and jet black eyes must have made a haunting impression on the homeowners that he had ambushed, and even the children that he had abducted. You could almost imagine those chiseled features gracing a high fashion runway, if not for that smile, as rotten as the soul behind it. By the time of his 1989 trial, Ramirez was missing several teeth, a distinctive detail that helped shape the police sketch that was instrumental in tracking him down. Ironically, the same state that he had once terrorized had footed the bill for his dental work behind bars, allowing him to restore the very smile that had once repulsed so many. But his reign couldn't last forever. One fateful night, that unforgettable face would become his downfall. It was only a matter of time before the darkness caught up with him. But that's a story for next time.
Evil is feelings and feelings and emotions like anger, hate, lust, and greed. Whereas if if I didn't give in to them, I would be crushed by them. Crimes they say I committed, I've been convicted of. I still have dreams of everything that has happened, yes. But I like nightmares. It is to get executed rather than spend the rest of my life in prison. I don't have any hope of getting out. And I don't see it as a reality, realistically, looking at it. I don't see myself walking the streets again. I was happy till the day I got arrested.
In the next episode, we're going to delve into the reign of terror that Richard Ramirez had unleashed upon California. The crimes, the investigation, and the relentless manhunt that finally brought him to justice. We're also going to hear from some brave survivors who had lived to tell the tale, and from some of the victims' families. But for now, I'm going to leave you with some chilling thoughts. How does a person go from a troubled child to a ruthless killer? How many lives can one man destroy before he's finally caught? How much darkness does it take to drown a conscience? And how long can one man terrorize a city before the night finally turns to day? The answer lies in the terror that gripped a city and the heart of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker.
Do I associate sex with violence? Break. Shit, man, that's a hard question. I don't know. I don't know. I can't answer that, Mikhail. I mean, okay, just no, we can't get into that. See, she tries and makes, keeps me going, but I can't. Don't laugh like that. You're making me laugh. I hope you edit this real good, Philip. Thank you. Okay, go ahead, man. What do I'm at a loss here. What do you want me to say? People.
Nothing. I wanted to say the things you've made me think you gotta
Hold on, Mike. Hold on. Look, sometimes I can't say what I really feel. I am pending trial here.
We talked openly after conviction about a 10-year-old girl that he kidnapped. And all he was concerned about in that case was the only thing he felt sorry for was a little puppy who got out. Didn't know if the dog made it out all right or, whatever happened to the little dog. He felt sorry for the dog. Didn't say anything about the girl or anybody else. So here he's sorry about a dog, but he doesn't care about what he just did.
As to sex and violence, many people are into S&M and bondage and stuff, and there's clubs that...
Yeah, we're talking about you.
Me? Well, sex and violence? Well, no, I don't think I'll answer that, no.
He was polite with me. He wasn't, like I said, he was more articulate, calm than any other murder suspect I've interviewed. Came from the physical description of a suspect of an attempted kidnapping out of the city of Pico Rivera. my mind started working, because before I got to homicide, I was going to Cal State LA. There was a professor there by the name of Robert Morneau, and I took advanced criminal investigation pertaining to sex crimes from him. And I remembered that there's a deviancy that says, I like to see a frightened look on your face. I want to see you scared. That's what really gets me turned on. That's excitement in them. With Maria Hernandez, he could have walked up behind her in silence and killed her. He didn't. He intentionally slapped the top of a car so that she could turn around and see him. Dale Okazaki, she was down on the ground, and he waited until he saw the fear in her eyes, then he shot her right here. Silent Yu, why wasn't she killed right there in the car? Whoever the suspect was wanted confrontation, wanted to see that fear. That's what started me thinking about perhaps one man doing this.
Alliance with the evil that is inherent in human nature.
Regretting is not my style. I cannot regret. It just isn't me.
Why, you feel it's threatening your well-being?
Possibly. I believe in fate, destiny.
Until next time, stay vigilant, stay safe, and keep your eyes open. You never know who might be watching you.